This is Cooly Skunk on the original PlayStation, also known as Punky Skunk in North America. It's a fun, albeit not exactly popular 2D platformer released in 1996, but as of last week, it's become a whole lot more interesting. You see, thanks to the efforts of the game preservation community, a complete version of the cancelled Cooly Skunk for Super Famicom was discovered and dumped. With all the talk of cross-generation games lately, Cooly Skunk offers an interesting insight into the transition from the Super NES period to PlayStation through a game that saw a direct conversion. So I was curious, how does this 16-bit Super Famicom version compare to the finished PlayStation version? Where did the game originate from? And what of the developers behind it? There's an interesting story here, so let's dive into this rather cool episode of DF Retro. Cooly Skunk was developed by a small Japanese company known as Ukiyo-te, founded in 1991 by Kenshi Naruse, previously of Capcom. Ukiyo-te would develop a surprisingly solid stable of games during its 11-year run. Its first game appeared in 1992, a platformer based on the movie Hook for Super NES. Published by Sony ImageSoft, this underrated game features beautifully detailed visuals, solid platforming action, and an amazing musical score. The palette shifting visible in the first stage, used to simulate different seasons, already showcases some of the cool ideas that the company had. Now, there were a lot of different games based on this film developed by a range of studios, but Ukiyo-te's original Super NES release is, in my opinion, the best of the bunch. This was followed up with the exceptional and equally underrated Skyblazer. At its core, it plays like a faster, smoother version of Hook in many ways, with a wide range of interesting level designs that make excellent use of the Super NES hardware. You don't hear a lot about these games, but I think that both are great platform action titles, and it's clear that there is a direct legacy between them and Cooly Skunk. Ukiyo-te would go on to develop other games following these projects though, including a wrestling title known as Burning Pro Wrestling, and a rather mediocre game based on Spawn. Burning Pro is the most interesting here, however, as it was published by Bulletproof Software of Tetris fame. Why does this matter? Well, according to an interview conducted by Bill's Cat Sox with the game's original director, the team was working to create a mascot game for Bulletproof in the style of Skyblazer, only aimed more at kids. This was known as Metamoru Kid Gumin, but due to a shift in the company, BPS cancelled it late in development. According to Naruse in the same interview then,
"From there, we entered negotiations with Visit, and they proposed that we use the game's engine to make a different game. The PlayStation had been released in Japan, but the Super Famicom was still going strong in the North American market, so the project was shifted to the Super Famicom for that market. The design and fart attack of the main character Cooly were both at the order of Visit. They told us this incorporated the opinions of North American buyers. We were just near finishing the Super Famicom version of Cooly when the PlayStation also broke into North America, and the Super Famicom market rapidly vanished. Buyers from the US also requested that we cancel it. This resulted in yet another suspension of development."
It's at this point that development was started a third time, this time on the PlayStation. Visit gave Ukiyo-te permission to retool the game to work on Sony's new machine, and thus Cooly Skunk for PlayStation was born. And mostly forgotten, unfortunately.
空からどんどんゲームが降ってくる。衛星から次々と送られてくるゲームソフトの放送プログラムを家庭で楽しむスーパーファミコン専用衛星放送アダプターサテラビュー。
Prior to the release of Cooly Skunk back in 1995, Nintendo and Sank Giga, a Japanese broadcast satellite provider, unleashed a new peripheral and service known as Satellaview for the Super Famicom, This add-on consisted of a modular base, the BSX cartridge, and a memory pack all connected to the satellite network. Through this service, users could access a wide range of content including games, news, and more, all accessible from a beautiful graphical interface accessed on your Super Famicom. The service saw a lot of exclusive content, including a full-on remake of the original Legend of Zelda complete with support for SoundLink, a feature which used the satellite radio technology to send pre-recorded audio through the system. That's right, voice acting and orchestral music was possible through the system, though only at the scheduled time. While it has its limitations, it was basically an early attempt at an interactive online marketplace complete with downloadable games and other content. All this back in 1995. So what does this have to do with Cooly Skunk then? Well, among many other releases for Satellaview, Cooly Skunk appeared as a demo on the service briefly. While it had been previewed in magazines and at a trade show prior to this, the demo version was the only version available for home players to play with, but only during a limited time and only on this service. Thanks to the memory packs, however, someone saved this demo and traded it in, and that pack was discovered recently at a shop in Japan. It was then purchased for over $500 and the community raised the money necessary to have it released. After its release, a user going by Master Fox discovered that the demo time limit could be removed, and by doing so, the entirety of the game could be played right up through the end credits. The acquisition of this game is extremely interesting, but if you want to know more, I do recommend checking out the article over on Gaming Alexandria, which goes into greater detail on this side of things. You'll find a link below. I also recommend reading and supporting this site, as they do a lot of great work in regards to preservation. It's really great and important stuff. Reaching this point though, where we have full access to the complete game, has been a long journey made possible by a lot of passionate people. I can't stress the importance of this sort of work. But now that it's widely available, it gives us insight into this version of the game and the changes made for the PlayStation version that was released. So, based on what we know, the PlayStation version is basically the third iteration of this game, but the publisher, Visit, insisted on enhancing the game to suit the more advanced PlayStation. What we have is a redesigned game with elements of the Super NES version included. Now, there were other games that released on both the Super NES and 32-bit consoles, of course, but because this was never officially released, the developers were able to push the PlayStation in ways that simply were not possible on Super NES. So Ukiyote completely revamped the game's presentation then. Sprites, background artwork, and the level design itself has all been reworked. The PlayStation has significantly more memory available and is more flexible in general than the Super NES, allowing for more detailed, unique artwork per stage. So let's begin this comparison straight from the beginning. Side by side, the two versions share the same basic logo, but the background art behind it is different. The introduction sequence, however, is very similar, at least at a glance. The basic flow of the scene is virtually identical between the two, but there are a couple big changes here. Firstly, the art itself has been completely redrawn on the PlayStation, and secondly, the story being told is completely different. On PlayStation, the game's villain, Badler, is basically told that Cooly Skunk is coming to fight against his BB Brigade. He laughs it off and sends his minions on their way. But on Super Famicom, the game focuses instead on Cooly's search for the legendary board, and Badler's desire to reach it first after discovering its existence on this island. Both games have story segments peppered throughout, but the PlayStation version features more of them in general. In particular, this first island serves as a tutorial of sorts for various gadgets created by Cooly's friend Kelly, who is promptly kidnapped after completing these first few stages. During these stages, Kelly also introduces various mini-games to the player, which can be found in later levels in the game, allowing you to earn extra lives. This is not present in the Super Famicom version. What does appear in both versions of the game, however, is this overhead map between stages. On Super Famicom, it's all contained within this rather static screen, which features all available worlds clearly visible. On PlayStation, however, the world is broken up into a series of islands, and the game zooms in on each island as you select it. I found this especially interesting since it seems that Ukiyote has a thing for these overworld maps, as both Hook and Skyblazer feature a similar map system between stages. I'm a fan of this design, so it works for me. Once you get into the game proper, however, the differences become more evident. The first few stages of the game are completely unique between the two versions. Now, the introduction of any game is important, so I can see why the team focused on creating even more polished stages to begin the PlayStation game. This first area on PS1 really puts a nice foot forward and it looks great. In comparison, the first stages on Super Famicom suffer from a lot of cheap hits. It can prove rather frustrating, especially at first. Clearly, the developers felt similarly and reworked the game significantly in bringing it to PlayStation, while also modifying the life system and changing the way in which enemies can appear on screen. It's a much more playable game. Once you get past this initial island, however, you start to notice some similarities between the two games, specifically in terms of level layout and design. This stage, for instance, has Cooly skating across a track while avoiding a bomb-tossing enemy on the adjacent track. The actual layout differs between the two, but the concept is identical. This section really highlights the new approach to artwork as well. Notice how the sprites feature additional frames of animation on PlayStation. Cooly's sprite updates every 10 frames on PS1, while Super Famicom features a new frame every 15 frames instead. The team also opted to angle the track downward to give it a 3D effect, while increasing the number of unique parallax layers, including this nice foreground with angled transparent beams of light slicing through the scenes, not to mention the leaf patterns. Due to palette limitations on the Super Famicom, it wouldn't have been easy to pull off such a foreground layer on that system. That said, Ukiote's Spawn game did play around with transparent light from this helicopter. It just worked as its own specific layer, similar to the spotlight in Super Mario World actually. Another similar level is this one, filled with spikes, platforms, and water. The level itself varies in design, but there are shared elements between them, like this middle section here surrounded with spikes. Again though, the developers have increased the complexity and detail of the artwork, taking advantage of the wider color palette available per tile. PS1 also features multiple parallax background layers, while on Super Famicom, in this stage at least, parallax scrolling is disabled. There's plenty of other similarities too with other stages, like this one here with the gliding area and the wind gusts. The layout differs, but both focus on paragliding at night against a cityscape. On PlayStation, the air jet effect has been changed, but you can see that Cooly Skunk on Super Famicom actually uses the same animated tiles as Skyblazer to create the same effect. This layer of course relies on color math to get the impression of true transparency, a common trick on the system. Throughout the game then, you'll encounter moments like this where stage concepts are retooled and reused in new ways. This forest stage is interesting, for instance. It shares the same tree trunk tile design between the two systems, but I also noticed these traversable trees. Ukiote really seems to have a thing for these in the forest stages. We see the same design here in the earlier stages of Skyblazer, and of course it's reused in Cooly Skunk. So at this point, let's step back and consider what PlayStation brings to the table in this game before moving on with our comparisons. Does this take advantage of then next generation technology? Well, at the time, I think a lot of folks would criticize the game for looking rather outdated due to the 2D nature of its design, but in retrospect, it not only holds up well, but it offers a significant upgrade over what was possible on 16-bit machines. It's a great looking 2D game. But it's not just about the visuals. The levels are expanded beyond the original game, or any other game Ukiote produced on Super Famicom. There's more room to explore, and the stages are less reliant on the stricter tile placement we saw on 16-bit titles. That said, it's not an overly ambitious game, and I'm sure it could have worked on a lesser machine, but these elements work together to create something that's visually striking and smooth playing. It still holds up. But beyond the visuals and game design itself, the audio received a significant revamp. Rather than rewriting all the music though, the original tracks from the Super Famicom version were redone for PlayStation with increased fidelity. Take a listen. It should be noted that the soundtrack was composed by Harumi Fujita and Yasuaki Fujita, both of whom worked on many great Capcom soundtracks such as Mega Man 3 prior to working with Ukiyo-te. There's another interesting comparison though when you reach the end of each island, boss fights. Many of the boss battles featured in the PlayStation game are lifted directly from the Super Famicom original, though with some changes. The differences tend to be split between visuals and battle design. There's extra flourishes added at points to ramp up the challenge more gradually or simply alter the pacing. This is evident in the battle here, where the number of hazards increases over time on PS1 instead of remaining consistent on Super Famicom. Or how about this one, where the concept remains the same, but the theme is entirely different on PlayStation, making the switch over to paddle boats. And this is true for most of the other battles in this game. Now, I didn't have a chance to complete the PlayStation game on this specific capture run, but I did finish the Super Famicom version, and that features a rather impressive final boss sequence showcasing the layer scaling and rotation features available on the Super Famicom. It looks great. But what I find so interesting about this situation is that the developers were essentially given the chance to refine and redo their creation. They finished the game once, and then were presented with an opportunity to completely revamp it on a new platform. That must have been extremely frustrating at the time, but at the same time, it's a unique opportunity that has produced fascinating results. At this point though, with the comparisons out of the way, I suppose the remaining question is, are these games any good, and how did they fare at the time? Rewind with me back to the launch of PlayStation. 3D graphics were huge. Everyone wanted polygonal games, and these new systems delivered them in spades. At the time, most reviewers and fans alike focused primarily on these 3D games. That's not to say there weren't 2D titles. The PlayStation launched with several games like this, including the legendary Rayman. There was room for them even if they weren't the focus. People still loved 2D platform games. And then, a year later, games like Super Mario 64 came along and changed what a platformer could be. At this point, it seemed like every developer that had previously released a 2D platform game wanted to shift to 3D. Characters like Rayman, Gex, Earthworm Jim, Donkey Kong, and many more all received 3D adventures in the years that followed. Then there's Cooly Skunk. While it did release early in Japan in 1996 as Cooly Skunk, it didn't launch in North America until 1998. Perhaps the point when 2D games were the least sought after by the market. It didn't make a dent. Now, I never liked the punk approach to the marketing as it doesn't really fit the rather cute character, but I'm not sure changing that would have mattered in 1998. It just wasn't a great time to release a 2D platformer. Although Castlevania Symphony of the Night, released back in 1997, was relatively successful, so I suppose there are arguments to be made if you're doing something new. As for Cooly Skunk, I've always been a fan. It's a cute, fun little game, and the kind of experience that we just saw less and less of over time, so its arrival was much appreciated. So how about the unreleased Super Famicom game? After completing it, it's clear to me that the development team released a much better game on the PlayStation. The extra time certainly resulted in a superior platformer. I would be curious to know just how complete the Super Famicom game was considered though, as there's more tweaking to be done. It feels as if the game is 90% there, but the enemy placement simply needs more work. It doesn't flow as smoothly as it should. Still, the rest of the package holds up nicely. It's a great looking game for the Super Famicom with huge, colorful sprites and detailed stages, plus an excellent soundtrack. Either way, the fact that it exists at all makes it super interesting to me. It's not often that a previously unreleased game appears like this. It gives us a lot of insight into what the developer was going through at the time and how they evolved when making the transition to next generation consoles. The circumstances of its retrieval also highlight the unique nature of the Satellaview system for its time period. This forward-looking technology offered a taste of the future in a way with downloadable content. It also highlights the dangers of a purely digital marketplace. If not for the memory pack on which the game was saved, it may never have been found. At the same time, the demo would likely have never been released without the Satellaview system. So it's a unique situation either way. And none of it would exist without the tireless efforts of the preservation community. This is a shining example of why their work is so important. But that's going to do it for this episode of DF Retro. Stay tuned after the credits for a preview of the next episode. And thanks for watching. On the next episode of DF Retro.